All right, let's dive straight into the mind-blowing origins of Yahweh. Get ready because what you're about to hear will completely shatter your traditional understanding of this figure. The God most of us have been taught to believe as the one and only creator of the universe. Yeah, well, Yahweh didn't start that way. The origins of Yahweh are far from what many religious institutions would have you believe. First, here's the shocker: Yahweh likely began as a storm god, deeply connected to the world of ancient Egypt and its surrounding regions. We're talking about a time when polytheism ruled the day, when gods weren't just abstract forces, but specific, localized beings controlling everything from the weather to war to fertility. Yahweh was one of these. And guess what? He wasn't even unique. He was part of a crowd of gods, most notably linked with storm and war. That's right, Yahweh wasn't this all-powerful monotheistic deity from the start. His early worshippers likely saw him as a warrior god, closely aligned with the natural world's chaotic, destructive forces. You might be asking, how do we know this? Archaeological finds and ancient texts from Egypt mention a people called the Sharsu. These were nomadic tribes that wandered through the deserts of the Levant in Egypt, and surprise, they worshipped Yahu or Yahweh. Not in the high, monotheistic sense we think of today, but as one god among many in their pantheon. Now let that sink in for a second. The God of the Bible may have started out as a regional storm deity worshipped by desert-dwelling nomads. Yahweh didn't remain in the background. His identity evolved, and quickly. As these nomads, the Shasu, interacted with neighboring cultures, Yahweh's role shifted, especially when he became identified with the broader Israelite community. In the Exodus story, which many of us know, Yahweh is depicted as this fierce, unstoppable force, raining down plagues and parting seas. These are classic storm god traits: control over the elements, over life and death, over nature's most violent expressions. This brings up a critical point. Yahweh's transformation from storm god to the supreme deity of Israel was not immediate. It was gradual, messy, and quite frankly, politically motivated. There's clear evidence that early Israelites didn't always worship Yahweh alone. They also revered other gods, Baal and even Asherah, the goddess who in some texts is Yahweh's consort. So how did Yahweh go from being one god among many to the top god? The answer lies in a very specific historical moment: the rise of Israelite nationalism. As the Israelites sought to distinguish themselves from surrounding cultures and solidify their identity, Yahweh's status was elevated. What a better way to unify a scattered, diverse group of tribes than rallying them around a single, all-powerful deity. Yahweh became a symbol of political loyalty and religious unity. This wasn't just about faith, it was about power. Yahweh evolved from a god of war and storms to a national deity, the singular force that defined Israelite identity. But don't let that gloss over the storm god roots. Early biblical descriptions of Yahweh still carry remnants of that chaotic, elemental nature. Read the Psalms or the earlier chapters of the Bible, and you'll find a God who controls storms, who rides the clouds, who commands thunder and lightning. Yahweh's journey to monotheism didn't erase these primal, ferocious traits, it just rebranded them. So there you have it. Yahweh, the God we think of today as the all-encompassing, omnipotent force behind everything, started off as one god in a long list of many, a warrior storm god worshipped by nomads in the deserts of Egypt and the Levant. What we know now as monotheism, it didn't happen overnight. Yahweh's rise to the top was a calculated evolution, blending faith, power, and politics. And this is just the beginning. We're only scratching the surface of how deep and complex these origins really are. Now, let's talk about the Shasu of Yahweh, the key to unlocking the ancient roots of the God of Israel. Here's where things get really interesting. We know Yahweh didn't start as Israel's exclusive deity, right? Well, his journey into Israel's religious identity begins with a group of nomadic desert tribes, known as the Sharsu, who roamed the deserts of the Levant and Sinai around the 14th to 12th centuries BCE. Who were these Sharsu? They were essentially wandering shepherds moving across vast desert regions between Egypt and Canaan, a sort of ancient Bedouin. What's fascinating is that these people didn't settle in cities. They didn't have centralized temples or powerful priesthoods like their Egyptian or Mesopotamian neighbors. They were out in the harsh wilderness, exposed to the brutal forces of nature, and they needed a God who could protect them in these extremes. That's where Yahweh came in. But here's the kicker. We have hard evidence that the Shasu worshipped Yahweh centuries before Israel even formed as a nation. Ancient Egyptian texts, particularly from the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, mention a place called the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. This is one of the earliest known references to Yahweh, and it's not in Israel, it's in the Egyptian borderlands. So Yahweh wasn't some unique Israelite creation. He was worshipped by these desert nomads long before Israel claimed him. But here's where things get even more mind-blowing. The Shasu's version of Yahweh was wild. He wasn't the calm, loving God you might expect. He was a fierce warrior-like deity, a god of the wilderness, perfectly suited to the harsh, chaotic environment where these people lived. Remember, this was a world where survival was never guaranteed. You didn't have laws or armies protecting you, just raw, primal nature. So you needed a god who could defend you from both natural and human threats. The Shasu carried this image of Yahweh with them as they migrated, moving between Egypt, Sinai, and eventually into the lands that would become Israel. This is where Yahweh's transformation began, where his identity started to merge with the emerging Israelite tribes who were seeking their own national god. These nomads, who had no formal religious institutions, introduced Yahweh to the Israelites, and slowly, this once local desert deity began to rise in prominence. Think about the implications of this. The Shasu of Yahweh were the original messengers who spread Yahweh's worship into the lands that eventually became Israel. Without these nomadic tribes, it's entirely possible that Yahweh would have remained a minor, localized god, known only to a small group of desert wanderers. But because of their migrations, because of their interaction with other cultures, Yahweh began to be adopted by a larger community. And as these early Israelite tribes fought for survival in Canaan, they found in Yahweh the perfect warrior god, one who had already proven himself capable of protecting desert nomads. So when the early Israelites encountered the Shasu and their worship of Yahweh, it wasn't just a cultural exchange, it was a religious revolution. Yahweh became not just a god of the Shasu, but the God of Israel, transformed from a fierce, desert deity into the central figure of monotheism. And this shift wasn't just about religion, it was about survival, politics, and the need for a unifying force. What's absolutely critical here is that Yahweh's rise to dominance in Israelite religion is directly linked to these desert tribes. The Shasu brought him out of the wilderness, but once he arrived in Israel, Yahweh wasn't content to stay a regional god. His identity began to shift, his influence grew, and before long he became the god, the single, exclusive deity that we associate with monotheism today. But remember, it all started with a small group of nomads wandering the harsh deserts of Sinai, calling upon Yahweh to protect them. This isn't the sanitized, simplified story we're often told. Yahweh's journey is wild, messy, and deeply tied to the people who needed him the most, the Shasu, whose fierce loyalty to their God laid the groundwork for the rise of Israel's defining deity. Here's something you may not have heard in Sunday school. Ancient Israel was not originally monotheistic. Let that sink in. Early Israelites, just like their neighbors, were polytheists. They worshipped a whole pantheon of gods. We're talking about big names like El, the chief god in Canaanite religion, often associated with creation, and Asherah, his consort, a powerful mother goddess. Not to mention Baal, the storm god who was often Yahweh's rival, and Molech, a god associated with child sacrifice. Yahweh was initially just one deity among many, and he had to compete for attention and devotion. The Israelites had shrines, they had idols, and they didn't see anything wrong with worshiping multiple gods. In fact, there's strong evidence in the biblical text itself that they believed in a divine council, a kind of heavenly court, where Yahweh sat as one God among others. You see this in passages like Psalm 82, where Yahweh stands in the assembly of gods and declares judgment on them. This wasn't just metaphorical. Early Israelites believed these gods were real. But here's where things start to change, the politics of religion. As Israel's identity began to solidify, especially during the time of the monarchies, the elites needed something to unite the tribes and separate them from their neighbors. What better way to do that than to elevate Yahweh above all the other gods? This wasn't about spiritual enlightenment, it was about national survival. The leaders of Israel wanted a single, unifying deity who could rally the people under one banner, and Yahweh, the warrior god they inherited from the Shasu, was the perfect candidate. Here's the twist. Monotheism wasn't introduced in a vacuum. It was a gradual process filled with resistance, rebellion, and conflict. The Bible itself is full of stories of the Israelites constantly turning back to other gods. Remember the golden calf in Exodus? That wasn't some random act of defiance. It was a reflection of how deeply embedded polytheism was in Israelite culture. Even as Yahweh's dominance grew, people still felt drawn to other gods, especially those tied to fertility, rain, and harvest, things that were crucial for survival in the ancient world. And speaking of resistance, let's talk about Asherah. Archaeological discoveries have shown that, for a long time, Yahweh had a consort, and it was her. Early inscriptions from places like Kuntilat Ajarod in the Sinai Desert show that Yahweh was often worshipped alongside Asherah, a powerful goddess symbolizing fertility and life. We're talking about Yahweh and his female counterpart, not Yahweh alone. In fact, you'll find references in the Bible to sacred poles or Asherah poles, which were likely symbols of her worship. And guess what? Those poles were set up in the very temples dedicated to Yahweh. So for a time, Yahweh was not the lone god, he shared the stage. The push for Yahweh's exclusive worship really gained traction during the reigns of kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who led major religious reforms. Josiah, in particular, went on a rampage to destroy all other forms of worship. He tore down the Asherah poles, smashed idols, and centralized worship at the Jerusalem temple, declaring that only Yahweh could be worshipped. This was not a gentle religious reform, it was a full-blown cultural revolution. And let's be clear, this wasn't just about piety, it was about political control. By eliminating other gods, the monarchy could consolidate power and unify the people under one religious system, one temple, and one god. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Even after these reforms, the lure of polytheism never completely disappeared. The prophets in the Bible spend a lot of time condemning the people for turning to other gods. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and others repeatedly rail against Israel for playing the harlot with Baal, Molech, and other deities. This wasn't some minor issue. Polytheism was a deeply ingrained part of Israelite culture, and shifting to monotheism was an uphill battle. Now let's get into the real fight that shaped the fate of monotheism, Baal. If you think the Bible is just a bunch of stories about faith and morality, think again. Beneath the surface, it's packed with cosmic battles between gods, and Yahweh's battle with Baal is front and center. This wasn't just a religious disagreement, it was a clash of titans that redefined Israelite identity, culture, and religion. Here's what a lot of people don't realize. Baal wasn't some insignificant minor god. He was a major player in the ancient Near East. The Canaanites worshipped Baal as their storm god, the one who brought rain, controlled fertility, and ensured their crops would grow. In a land dependent on agriculture, Baal was the god of life itself, and his influence spread far and wide, even among early Israelites. In fact, Baal was so popular that he was often seen as Yahweh's direct rival. Baal and Yahweh weren't just competing for worship, they were competing for cosmic supremacy. The ancient world didn't have room for two storm gods, and this is where the tension boiled over. The Bible documents a full-scale battle between these two deities, and it wasn't just theological, it was a literal fight for dominance in the hearts and minds of the people. One of the clearest examples of this is the famous showdown on Mount Carmel in the book of 1 Kings. Picture this: Elijah, Yahweh's prophet, stands against 450 prophets of Baal in an epic contest to see whose God is truly the real deal. The challenge? Both sides prepare a sacrifice, but they won't light the fire. Instead, they call on their gods to send down fire from the sky. This is Yahweh's moment to prove he's not just a local deity, but the God of all creation. And guess what? Baal's prophets shout, dance, and even cut themselves, but nothing happens. Baal doesn't show up. Then Elijah steps up, calls on Yahweh. Then fire rains down from heaven, consuming the entire sacrifice. The people fall to their knees and declare, Yahweh, he is God. But this wasn't just about fire, it was about Yahweh asserting his control over the elements, proving that Baal, the so-called storm god, was powerless. Now, here's the deeper significance. This wasn't just some divine magic trick to impress the crowds. This was Yahweh's declaration of war on Baal. For the Israelites, this event symbolized Yahweh's victory over the Canaanite gods and a turning point in their religious identity. But don't think the fight ended there. This was an ongoing, brutal struggle for centuries, where the Israelites constantly wavered between Yahweh and Baal, caught in the tension of their neighboring cultures. What's really wild is that this wasn't just a spiritual struggle, it was deeply political. The kings of Israel and Judah used this religious conflict to consolidate their power. Some, like King Ahab, actually supported the worship of Baal, even building altars and temples for him in Israel. Others, like King Josiah, made it their mission to wipe out Baal worship completely. These weren't just personal religious preferences. These were political moves designed to either align with or separate from the surrounding Canaanite and Phoenician cultures who were steeped in Baal worship. And let's not forget Baal's role in agricultural survival. When you're living in an ancient society where your very livelihood depends on rain and fertile land, you're going to worship the God who promises those things. That's why Baal was so irresistible. Yahweh, originally a war god, had to transform into a deity who could also control the rains, harvests, and fertility. He had to become all-encompassing to beat Baal at his own game. This explains why so many Israelites kept turning back to Baal, even after monumental events like Mount Carmel. Baal was the god they turned to when they needed assurance for their crops, their survival. Yahweh had to fight tooth and nail, not just to claim spiritual superiority, but to prove he could handle every aspect of life, from water to weather, from heaven to earth. Yahweh had to expand his portfolio, so to speak. This cosmic battle between Yahweh and Baal wasn't just about who had the best theology. It was about who controlled reality itself. And through fiery demonstrations, wars, political upheavals, and relentless religious reforms, Yahweh finally emerged as the uncontested God of Israel. But it took centuries of conflict, cultural tension, and divine showdowns for that to happen. Let's dive into the next crucial chapter of Yahweh's story, his transformation from a storm god of war into the covenant God of Israel. This shift is not just theological, it's a complete rebranding of Yahweh's role, character, and relationship with the people. And make no mistake, this wasn't a natural, inevitable change. This was deliberate and driven by the needs of a nation struggling for survival and identity. So here's the thing. Yahweh started out as this fierce, raw force controlling storms, leading Israel into battle and smashing enemies. But as Israel developed from a loose collection of tribes into a more established kingdom, Yahweh had to evolve too. The people needed more than a warrior God, they needed a God of promises, a God of covenants, someone who wasn't just about destruction, but also about order, justice, and protection. Yahweh wasn't just out there to wield lightning, he had to become a deity who could enter into a binding relationship with his people. This shift is where Yahweh becomes not just a figure of fear, but a figure of trust. The turning point. The covenant with Abraham and later the covenant at Mount Sinai. In these moments, Yahweh makes a radical departure from his storm god persona. He's no longer just controlling the forces of nature. Now he's controlling destiny. He binds himself to the fate of Israel in a way that no other god in the ancient Near East was doing. Yahweh promises Abraham that his descendants will become a great nation. But this is more than a simple promise. This is Yahweh linking his own divine future to the survival and success of Israel. It's a bold move for a God who, up until this point, was more concerned with battling chaos than nurturing a nation. And don't think for a second this was some peaceful transition. When Yahweh reveals himself as a covenant God, it comes with conditions. We're talking about laws, commandments, and a serious demand for loyalty. This isn't a soft, loving God handing out blessings like candy. Yahweh lays down the law at Sinai, and it's intense. He gives 613 commandments, that's right, not just 10, but hundreds of laws that dictate everything from how to worship to how to live daily life. Yahweh isn't just protecting the Israelites anymore, he's ruling them with an iron fist of divine law. This is where Yahweh's evolution really takes shape. He goes from being this cosmic storm god who rages and destroys to a God who's deeply involved in every aspect of his people's lives. He's not distant anymore. He's up close, personal, and he's got expectations. The Israelites aren't just worshipers now. They're partners in a covenant, and that covenant is both a blessing and a burden. Break it, and Yahweh's wrath still comes down hard, just like the old days. Keep it, and Yahweh promises to make Israel the most powerful, blessed nation on earth. This is where Yahweh shows his duality. He's both the giver of life and the bringer of death, depending on how the covenant plays out. But let's be clear, this covenant shift wasn't just a religious move. It was also political. As Israel transitioned into a kingdom, the leaders needed Yahweh to be more than just a God of war. They needed him to be a God of governance, a divine king who would legitimize their rule and give them a moral foundation for society. This is where Yahweh becomes not just a God of the battlefield, but a God of the throne room. His covenant becomes a legal contract, binding Israel to him, but also binding Yahweh to Israel. It's a two-way street. This is a radical shift for a God who was once just another figure in the pantheon. Now, Yahweh is saying, I'm your God, and you're my people, forever. Yahweh's rebranding as a covenant God wasn't just about keeping Israel in line religiously, it was about national unity. The covenant gave Israel a shared identity, a sense of destiny that no other God could offer. No longer was Yahweh just a local God of storms and war. He became the God of history, the God who shapes the future of Israel, and by extension, the future of the world. His promises, his laws, his role as the architect of Israel's fate elevated him above all the other gods who were still stuck in their old roles as forces of nature or tribal protectors. Now, let's crack open the story of how Yahweh's image was shaped by two distinct competing sources in the Bible, the priestly and Yahweh's traditions. This is where things get complicated and fascinating. Yahweh isn't a simple, one-dimensional figure. He's the product of multiple theological perspectives, and the Bible reflects that with two very different portrayals of who Yahweh is and how he interacts with the world. First up, let's talk about the Yahweh source, the JE source in biblical scholarship. This is the raw, intimate version of Yahweh. We're talking about a hands-on God who's directly involved with humanity in very personal ways. In the Yahwist account, Yahweh walks in the Garden of Eden, forms Adam out of the dust with his own hands, and talks face-to-face with his creation. Yahweh in this version is approachable. He's almost like a cosmic craftsman, molding the world piece by piece, deeply embedded in the physical and emotional aspects of creation. But here's what makes this portrayal stand out. Yahweh is immanent, meaning he's up close and personal. He's a God of relationships, of interaction, of immediacy. He cares about what's happening in the here and now. The Yahwist Yahweh is present in every moment, walking, talking, and sometimes even wrestling. Think Jacob at Nil. This is a God who gets his hands dirty, who isn't afraid to be directly involved in the messy, unpredictable lives of human beings. Now, shift gears to the priestly source, or the TPI source. This is Yahweh on another level. The priestly writers present Yahweh as a God of order, law, and distance. In this version, Yahweh doesn't walk in gardens or chat with humans. He speaks the universe into existence from afar. It's precise, it's structured, and it's methodical. The priestly Yahweh creates the cosmos in a series of commands. Let there be light, let the waters gather, and so on. This is a God who operates by decree, and everything is set in its place by divine fiat. What's fascinating here is the difference in tones. The priestly Yahweh is all about structure. He's the architect of the cosmos, the one who sets the laws of nature and society. Everything is perfectly ordered in the priestly version, from the days of creation to the rituals of the temple. And when it comes to the relationship between God and humanity, there's a lot more distance. Yahweh's interaction with humans is often mediated through priests, sacrifices, and rituals. You don't just walk up to this God. There are rules, protocols, and boundaries. This difference isn't just theological, it's deeply political. The priestly source reflects the interests of the temple elite, the religious authorities who ran the show in ancient Israel. For them, Yahweh was a God of purity, law, and ritual. They wanted a God who reinforced their power structure, a deity whose presence was mediated through sacrifice, rituals, and priesthood. In their view, Yahweh wasn't your buddy. He was the ultimate sovereign, the divine ruler whose presence was dangerous unless approached properly. But here's the kicker. These two versions of Yahweh, immanent and transcendent, personal and distant, were both preserved in the Bible. They weren't erased or edited out. They sit side by side, sometimes even in the same book. Take Genesis, for example. In Genesis 1, we get the priestly Yahweh creating the universe with perfect, divine order. Then, in Genesis 2, suddenly Yahweh's in the garden, forming Adam from the ground with his bare hands. Two stories, two Yahwehs, but both are part of the same sacred text. Why? Because ancient Israel wasn't a monolithic culture. It was a collection of tribes, traditions, and perspectives, all of which had their own take on Yahweh. The Yahweh source comes from a southern tradition, closer to the rural, earthy roots of the people. The priestly source, on the other hand, reflects the urban, temple-centered religion of the north. These two perspectives didn't cancel each other out, they coexisted, and the Bible is the product of that tension. It's a theological collage where different communities, with different experiences of Yahweh, contributed their own stories and ideas. What's wild is how these two portrayals of Yahweh reveal contradictory ideas about God, yet they were both considered sacred. Yahweh is both the God who walks among his people and the God who rules from on high. He's both the God of the everyday and the God of cosmic law. The Yahwist and priestly sources reflect two different needs: the need for a God who's close and intimate, and the need for a God who's distant, powerful, and beyond comprehension. This dual portrayal of Yahweh challenges the simplistic view that the Bible offers a single, unified vision of God. It shows that Yahweh's character is multifaceted, shaped by the needs of different communities at different times. And here's the thing, both versions were essential. Israel needed a God who could walk with them through the dirt and struggle of daily life. But they also needed a God who stood above it all, imposing order on a chaotic world. Why does the Bible have so many different creation stories? We've seen Yahweh's journey from storm god to covenant god, the rivalry with Baal, and even the contrasting images of Yahweh in the Yahwist and priestly traditions. But there's still a massive question looming over all of this. Why keep all these different stories, perspectives, and contradictions? Why didn't the Bible just clean things up and give us one neat, unified narrative? Here's the answer. Because these multiple stories were never meant to be unified in the first place. They're there because they represent different facets of Yahweh's character and Israel's understanding of God. The Bible wasn't written as a systematic theology manual. It's a collection of texts that grew out of the messy, complex history of a people constantly trying to make sense of their relationship with the divine. Think about it, Genesis alone has two distinct creation accounts. In the first one, Yahweh creates the world in 6 days, speaking everything into existence with divine precision. That's the priestly version. Then, in the very next chapter, Yahweh is planting a garden, forming humanity from the dirt. That's the Yahwist version. Why leave these two stories side by side, even though they contradict each other in the details? It's because the Bible's writers weren't interested in erasing diversity. They were interested in preserving the fullness of Israel's relationship with Yahweh, even if that meant including multiple, conflicting stories. And let's not forget, these stories aren't just about creation, they're about cosmic order versus chaos. They reveal a deeper truth about Yahweh, that he isn't just a distant creator, but also a warrior, a God who's actively fighting to maintain order in a chaotic universe. Whether it's Yahweh battling sea monsters in the Psalms or speaking the cosmos into existence in Genesis, the message is clear: creation isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing struggle between order and chaos, and Yahweh is at the center of that battle. This is why there are so many creation stories, not because the Bible is confused or inconsistent, but because each story reveals a different dimension of Yahweh's relationship with creation. In Isaiah, we see Yahweh as the one who brings justice and order to the nations. In Proverbs, Yahweh creates the world alongside wisdom in an act of divine craftsmanship. These aren't just random stories, they're theological reflections, each one offering a unique perspective on who Yahweh is and what it means to live in a world created by him. But here's the kicker. These stories don't just tell us about Yahweh, they tell us something about ourselves. They reflect the human need to understand the divine in all its complexity. Yahweh isn't a static figure. He evolves, adapts, and takes on different roles depending on what Israel needs. Sometimes they need a warrior to protect them from chaos. Sometimes they need a father to guide them with wisdom. And sometimes they need a king to rule with justice and power. What this means for us today is huge. Faith isn't about having all the answers or locking God into one role. It's about embracing the mystery and complexity of the divine. Yahweh's story shows us that the divine is too vast, too multifaceted to fit into one neat box. The Bible keeps all these different stories because it understands that no single story can capture the fullness of who God is. And that's the brilliance of it. The Bible doesn't try to reconcile these different visions of Yahweh, it celebrates them. It's a testament to the fact that Yahweh can be both near and distant, both personal and cosmic, both warrior and creator. These stories aren't contradictions, they're windows into the mystery of the divine, giving us a richer, more complete understanding of the God who's at the heart of Israel's faith. So when we look at the Bible today, we should embrace that complexity. We should appreciate that Yahweh is a God who defies easy categorization, a God who can't be pinned down to just one role or one story. And in that complexity, we find a God who's real, dynamic, and constantly revealing himself in new ways. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this deep dive into the origins of Yahweh and the complex, fascinating nature of biblical monotheism. If you found this video thought-provoking, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content that dives into the hidden truths of ancient history and theology. Your support means everything. And remember, God bless us all.